If the Model T Ford put America on wheels, you could argue the '49 Ford station wagon put the baby boom on wheels. Hi there, Rick DeBrule with another chapter in the automotive evolution, here once again at the Martin Auto Museum, a great collection of more than 170 cars here in Phoenix. Each one a different chapter in the automotive evolution. And this car right here, this 1951 Ford Country Squire station wagon, well, this is both an important and fun chapter in the automotive evolution. We'll talk more about this car in a moment, but first, make sure you like and subscribe, and make sure you let me know in the comments down below what I got right, what I got wrong, because there's always something I'm going to get wrong. Now, before we go too much into the history of this particular car, I want to take a step back and talk about the history of station wagons. The roots of the station wagon really stretch back to the early part of the 20th century. You know, back then, cars were pretty much just a novelty. And in the 1910s and the 1920s, the early 1920s, the automobile was slowly replacing the horse-drawn carriage. But one thing was missing. There really wasn't a practical way to carry a larger number of passengers and their luggage in just one vehicle. That's where the Model T comes in. Most specifically, the Model T Depot Hack. Now, this was built on the rugged Model T chassis. Now, these vehicles they featured wooden bodies. They were used primarily to shuttle passengers and their belongings from train depots. Depot Hack, that's where they get the name. They weren't actually built by Ford directly, but they were using independent coach builders who used the Model T reliable base. The name Depot Hack, once again, just reflecting on their role at the train station. And over time, they realized it wasn't a train depot, it was a station wagon. There the name evolved. By the 1930s, automakers started to bring wagon production in-house. During World War II, production of civilian vehicles stopped, as we know, altogether. No new wagons were built between 1942 and 1945 for civilians, as automakers focused on the war effort. When peace returned, car production resumed as well. The first post-World War II station wagon, produced by a U.S. automaker, was Ford, with the 1946 Ford Super Deluxe station wagon. Although the design was based on pre-war tooling and styling, especially the 1942 models, Ford was really the first major American automaker to resume production of station wagons for the civilian market after the war ended. And then came 1949. This was the year that everything changed. Ford introduced its first truly post-war car line, completely redesigned from the ground up. And with it came this car right here, the 1949 Ford Country Squire station wagon. It was the first of the big three to have a new station wagon, although Hudson did have a new one in 1948. But the Country Squire retained the wood body tradition, and its design, though, was still thoroughly modern. Rounded fenders, integrated headlights, a lower, sleeker profile that really made it feel more like a car of the future. It was built with real maple and mahogany, and the wooden panels, these were structural. They weren't just decorative. The 1949 Country Squire was not just beautiful, it was really a symbol. It was a symbol of prosperity, of adventure, of the growing middle class, the baby boom era that wanted both style and space inside. It was perfect for camping trips. It was perfect for just taking the kids to school in serious style. Before I walk around and show you the styling on that 1949 Ford Country Squire station wagon, I want to show you something else very briefly. This is a 1948 Ford Super Deluxe Tudor sedan we just happen to have here at the museum. And this is what we could talk about with the pre-war styling. Look how this hood angles in a point to the very front, and these big flat fenders that come off to the side. This is the end of the pre-war styling for Ford. Because in 1949, everything changed. Look how radically different the styling is on this 1949 front end compared to that 1948. Instead of that pointy hood that you saw with those flat fenders that went off, now it still has a raise to it in the center, but this is a much broader section to the very front. Look at this grille. This is that aviation inspired, they call it the bullet nose, but if you'll notice, there's actually 4 points. One on the top, one on the bottom, 2 on either side. Really, it's designed to look like a propeller, like this car was going to be flying. You look down the side and really it's got a slab side look to it. In fact, they called this the shoebox style back in those days. Had a lower belt line, generally had a lower roof line, although with the station wagons, they raised it just a little bit so they could have just a little bit more room all the way around. And significantly, the chassis was all new. 114-inch wheelbase, have a nice broad style in terms of the way it was able to transport. But of course, the star of the show today is this wood. Absolutely beautiful. You know, this was actually part of the structure, as I mentioned. Mahogany wood panels surrounded by solid maple and birch framing. The wood was actually built separately at Ford's Iron Mountain plant in Michigan. Then it was mated to the steel body in the final assembly. And Ford had his own forest for growing that. The rear doors, the quarter panels, the tailgate, they were all wood framed in their sections. Although beautiful, it did add complexity and cost, which is why in just a couple years the concept of the Woody was going away. And in fact, in 1949, Chevrolet was already introducing the all-steel station wagon. All right, let's slide in and take a look at the interior of our 1949 Ford Country Squire station wagon because, you know, really this marked a pretty important change in design and construction from the 1948 model. The 1948 Country Squire still carried a lot of pre-war elements such as a more upright dashboard, some traditional wood framing throughout. Whereas the 1949 model, well, this one embraced a more, well, let's call it integrated approach. The dashboard in the 1949 Country Squire is really all steel. Unlike the 48, it used a two-piece dashboard in 48 with two separate round instrument clusters right here. The 1949 just had a single speedometer right here with the temperature and fuel gauges built into it. Knobs and switches were repositioned, had a much cleaner layout, simplified controls, a push-button radio option was available. You see it right there, pretty cool. Seating also changed. The 1948 model used flat bench seats with minimal contouring and traditional upholstery materials, cloth. In 1949, the seats were redesigned with improved support, and they used both vinyl and cloth combination to match the car's updated look. The rear compartment, still very spacious, able to carry passengers and either be folded down for cargo or have seating arrangements, but it was still refined and just a little bit better, once again lining up with Ford's new design philosophy. One of the key differences, though, inside was how wood was used. In the 1948 model, the wood was structural. It was a prominent feature, including exposed framing throughout. For 1949, the Country Squire's wooden elements that you see all the way through the back really just became decorative rather than structural. The interior wood panels were now veneer over metal surfaces. It looked like it had that traditional wood appeal, but it was really easier for mass production and for durability as well. The 1949 Country Squire really represented a move towards modern automotive interior, production efficiency, and visual appearance. It was all a good balance. It kept some of the same character from the earlier models, but had a design that aligned more closely with that mid-century expectation. All right, let's take a look under the hood because the 1949 Ford has a really classic engine, a 239 cubic inch flathead engine. It's part of a series of side valve engines that first made headlines back in 1932. Back then, Ford really revolutionized the automotive industry in the United States by offering a mass-produced V8 at an affordable price. It brought V8 performance to the everyday driver, something no other automaker was doing at that point in time. Now, the 239 cubic inch version of that Ford Flathead really didn't appear until 1939, and it didn't appear in Fords. It was used exclusively in the Mercury models. It was a bump in performance from the smaller 221 cubic inch engine. And then in 49, well, that's when it made its way into Ford branded cars like the Country Squire station wagon, part of the company's bold post-war design. Now, technically, the 239 was a flathead, meaning the valves were placed in the block, not on the cylinder head. In its 1949 form, it produced about 100 horsepower. Now, it had good low-end torque, which gave the car some strong pulling power and, most importantly, a smooth, relaxed driving experience. It was perfect for cruising those newly paved post-war highways. Fuel was delivered through a single one-barrel carburetor downdraft. The ignition system was a 6-volt coil and distributor setup. Oil circulation was full pressure, a step up from the earlier flatheads, which relied on what they called called a splash lubrication system, which really was not nearly as effective. Now, the 239 cubic inch Flathead V8 continued in Ford passenger cars all the way through 1953. But in 54, well, that's when Ford introduced the Y-block V8. Featured a much more modern engineering, higher power potential. But in 49, this engine, this car right here, at this point in time, well, this was probably the ultimate evolution of that original Flathead Ford V8. You know, the 1940s were a pretty tumultuous time for Ford. I mean, first off, you had World War II, which shut down auto production, although as it turns out, they were very successful in helping with the war effort and making a lot of money in that world. But significantly, in 1943, Edsel Ford passed away. He had taken over running the company from Henry Ford. And he was much more modern in his thinking. Henry Ford then took over the company for 2 years from 1943 to 1945. And let's face it, he was not a forward-thinking individual in terms of the 1940s looking into what the 1950s would be. Henry Ford II, Henry Ford's grandson, then took over control of the company in 1945 as president, and I think he became CEO in 1947. This 1949 style was the first one that Henry Ford II had his arms wrapped around. They needed this to be a success as they move forward. And the reality is they nailed it. They nailed it from a styling perspective. They nailed it from a technical perspective, an engineering perspective down below. And while the Woody itself was not going to continue on for very much longer, they were going to go to steel-sided station wagons very shortly. The concept of having this wood, well, it still made the Woody wagon a very elegant thing. And the combination of that with the 1949 styling, well, it was a bold step forward for moving the baby boom onto the road and carrying that big horde of kids in the back.